Imagine a spring morning in Mississippi, 1843, where the river fog curls around white, pillared mansions like a shroud. Beneath the grandeur, behind the perfumed halls and manicured gardens, a darkness thrived, an obsession so cruel that even the elite whispered about it in fear. This is not a tale of mere cruelty. It is a descent into a system of control, where bloodlines mattered more than bodies, where appearances were law, and where one woman's obsession would destroy the innocence of her own daughter. Lucinda Kellerman, mistress of a sprawling 4,000-acre plantation, was a woman who measured life in perfection, silver-polished, flowers aligned, and obedience extracted like gold from her enslaved workers. Yet her obsession was not with wealth, nor with the prosperity of the estate, but with her daughter, Catherine. At 19, Catherine's body defied her mother's will, grotesquely obese by the standards of Southern high society. She was not just a disappointment. She was a threat to Lucinda's legacy, a public stain upon her meticulously cultivated image. But this story is not about rebellion. It is about the system that enabled it, the same society that demanded perfection, that worshipped virtue, that praised discipline, also buried secrets so dark that no ledger, no diary, no whispered conversation would ever fully expose them. Yet in the shadowed archives of Adams County, a leather-bound diary survived, a document revealing the meticulous orchestration of a mother's experiment on her own child. What was considered discipline by society's standards was, in truth, a calculated form of psychological and physical domination. Lucinda had the means, the knowledge, and the enforcers to execute her plan. 3 men, bound by survival and fear, tasked with remaking Catherine in the image of propriety, brick by brick, body by body. The barn at the edge of the estate, isolated beneath an ancient grove of live oaks, became the theater of this experiment. Within those timbered walls, labor would serve as punishment, exhaustion as instruction, and isolation as transformation. There were no mirrors, no witnesses, only the cold precision of orders and the echoing footsteps of those who obeyed. Catherine was not asked for consent. Her existence became a canvas for her mother's vision, a vision that blurred cruelty with control and obsession with morality. And what you must understand, before you descend further into this history, is that nothing here is isolated. The cruelty of one mother reflected the unspoken pact of an entire society, elite families, doctors, ministers, and neighbors, who agreed to see without seeing, to participate in a conspiracy of silence so complete that the truth nearly vanished forever. Tonight, you will step into that hidden world, and once you see what follows, there is no return. Catherine's first morning in the barn began like the opening of a nightmare she could not wake from. Dawn had not yet broken when the 3 men, Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel, stood silently as Lucinda's instructions fell like iron on their shoulders. These were not idle chores, this was orchestration, the measured destruction of a will disguised as improvement. Catherine was to grind corn, lift 50-pound sacks, split firewood, perform labor calibrated to exhaust, humiliate, and reshape. Each task was a test of endurance, not of skill. Each movement was a line in a ledger of obedience that her mother would later inspect with clinical detachment. The barn itself became an instrument of the experiment. Its high ceilings amplified every groan, every sigh, every scrape of stone on grain. Catherine's breathing echoed like a drum, marking time in a rhythm that the men could not ignore, even if they wished to. The 3 overseers were caught between obedience and conscience. Joshua, hardened by a lifetime of toil, cataloged every cruelty with a precision that suggested a private, silent rebellion. Samuel, who had once been literate in ways that could rival a plantation master, observed, recorded, and anticipated. Daniel, barely 16, flinched at each sound, yet saw the patterns others missed, recognizing that this was more than labor. It was a system designed to break her, and perhaps them too. Catherine herself reacted with a quiet resignation that unsettled even the men who had witnessed horrors before. She did not cry, did not plead, did not speak beyond requests for water. Her silence was a shield, a withdrawal from a world that demanded she be less than herself. And yet, there was something quietly defiant in the way she moved, an instinctive preservation of her body and her mind. Even as she became a subject in her mother's cruel experiment, Lucinda arrived each afternoon like a scientist inspecting her most prized specimen. With a leather-bound journal in hand, she circled Catherine, measuring, noting, evaluating. Each reduction in weight, each blistered hand, each tremor in her eyes was meticulously recorded. The entries reflected satisfaction and calculation, but never compassion. Here, discipline and obsession intertwined. Catherine's suffering was a proof of principle, a testament to the authority of appearances over human dignity. Outside the barn, the world moved on, blissfully unaware. The plantation's social network, neighbors, ministers, families, was complicit, each member performing the ritual of ignorance. It was this conspiracy, this carefully maintained silence, that allowed the experiment to unfold. What you must understand is that cruelty, when sanctioned and systematized, becomes invisible. And what you are about to witness is not just the story of one girl, one mother, or one barn. It is the revelation of how control, obsession, and social complicity can erase innocence, twist morality, and make monsters of ordinary people. Days in the barn became weeks, and the relentless rhythm of labor began to warp time itself. Catherine's body ached in ways she had never known, every muscle protesting, every joint screaming, yet her mind started to fragment, adapting to a reality that was more prison than home. The three men, once silent enforcers of her mother's will, became reluctant witnesses to a transformation neither fully understood nor desired. Joshua moved with quiet precision, always near enough to offer aid but distant enough to maintain the illusion of authority. Samuel observed, recording inconsistencies, mapping weaknesses, and seeing patterns in Catherine's endurance that Lucinda could never have predicted. Daniel, whose youth made him vulnerable, became the most attentive, noting the subtle shifts in her eyes, her posture, the way exhaustion altered her expression. The work was brutal by design. Grain was ground until the stone hummed, sacks of corn were carried across the barn until arms and legs quivered, and firewood was split until blisters became permanent fixtures on her hands. Every motion was a measure of compliance, every drop of sweat a line in the ledger of control. Lucinda visited like clockwork, inspecting, measuring, and documenting with detached fascination. Her journal entries were cold, precise, a narrative that could only exist in the mind of someone who had replaced empathy with obsession. Weight, circumference, callus formation, posture, all were recorded with the clinical objectivity of a surgeon examining a cadaver. But she did not account for what was happening inside Catherine, where fear and survival were weaving a quiet, dangerous resilience. In the silence between tasks, Catherine began to speak, not to her mother, but to the men. "Do you hate me?" she asked Joshua one afternoon, her voice a fragile thread in the vast barn. It was not accusation, but confession. Joshua's hands froze, his response measured. "Hate takes energy," he said. "Energy better spent on surviving." Those words were not comfort, they were instruction. And yet, in that exchange, a shift occurred. Catherine began to perceive the men, not as extensions of her mother's cruelty, but as human beings trapped within the same system. Samuel revealed fragments of his past. Daniel shared his silent dreams of freedom, and Joshua allowed glimpses of his life beyond the fields. It was in these quiet, whispered exchanges that Catherine discovered a new truth. Control, no matter how absolute, depended on compliance. And compliance was never inevitable. Even within the system, cracks could form, and resistance, however small, could begin. Here, in the barn, surrounded by echoes of labor and domination, the first seeds of understanding were planted. Catherine began to see the architecture of her own oppression. the invisible rules, the complicity of others, the unspoken agreements that permitted cruelty to flourish, and she began to understand that knowledge itself could be a weapon. By the end of the first month, Catherine's body was a map of exhaustion, her skin roughened by constant labor, her muscles taut with unaccustomed strain, yet her mind had begun to awaken in ways Lucinda had never intended. She observed patterns, rhythms, and weaknesses in the system around her. The predictable visits of her mother, the routines of the three men, the subtle shifts in timing that dictated her every movement. Every sound, every shadow in the barn became data, a measure of control she could not yet wield, but could recognize. The three men, once mere enforcers, began to navigate a precarious moral terrain. Joshua, scarred and silent, carried a quiet authority that allowed him to intervene subtly, shifting a sack here, easing a weight there, without drawing attention. Samuel's literacy became a tool, not just for compliance but for observation, recording anomalies, noting where the regimen could falter. Daniel, young but keenly perceptive, acted as the observer of observers, his attention catching details the others missed. The timing of Lucinda's footsteps, the expression in her eyes when a task was completed, the fleeting hesitation that betrayed satisfaction or frustration. Catherine began to test boundaries in imperceptible ways, a pause slightly longer than allowed, a breath held a fraction too long, small gestures that defied the mechanical rhythm Lucinda had imposed. Each act was measured, calculated, unspoken, a silent assertion of autonomy. She discovered that the men, despite their fear, were capable of discretion, capable of bending rules in ways that did not attract punishment. And in these small openings, a dangerous awareness began to form. The system was not absolute. It could be observed, understood, and, if played carefully, subtly influenced. Lucinda's afternoon inspections became ritualized theater. She circled, measured, recorded, and left, believing that every gesture and note reinforced her authority. Yet in her obsessive documentation, she revealed more than she intended. Patterns emerged, the fatigue threshold of her daughter, the limits of the men, the minute inconsistencies in task execution. Catherine absorbed these patterns like a sponge, each one a piece of forbidden knowledge. Knowledge that, in the right hands, could alter the very architecture of her oppression. And yet, the barn was more than labor and observation. It was an incubator of fear and secrecy. Each day reinforced the stakes of discovery. Whispers could mean punishment, hesitation could mean exile or worse. The men, bound by fear, executed tasks with precision, yet their humanity surfaced in subtle ways. It was here, in this intersection of cruelty, survival, and quiet rebellion, that Catherine realized a truth both terrifying and liberating. Power is never given freely. It is observed, it is exploited, and it is stolen by those who understand the system better than those who enforce it. Spring bled into early summer, and the first of the other daughters arrived at neighboring estates, each brought under the guise of refinement, but immediately subjected to the same cruel architecture Catherine had endured. The pattern was now unmistakable: isolation, exhaustion, and enforced labor masked as transformation. Daniel, tasked with deliveries between barns, began to notice the repetition, the same exhausted postures, the same hollow gazes, the same mechanical obedience. Each girl was a mirror of the last, a living record of systems designed not for growth, but for domination. Catherine, now 6 weeks into her ordeal, observed everything. She noticed how fear controlled the three men, how each obeyed not out of loyalty but survival, and how the women of the elite orchestrated compliance like conductors of a sinister symphony. Lucinda's precision, once terrifying, became predictable. Every afternoon visit followed the same rhythm: entries recorded, measurements taken, assessments delivered, and in those repeated patterns, Catherine discovered an opportunity. The tiniest opening where influence could be exercised, the single point where observation became power. The other girls, under the stewardship of their own overseers, arrived in staggered waves. Rebecca Cartwright, delicate and defiant, quickly discovered that submission was not an act of weakness but of endurance. Emma Singleton, intellectual and proud, resisted quietly, her defiance expressed in subtle gestures rather than open rebellion. Sarah Whitfield, compassionate and secretive, held on to knowledge forbidden to her peers. And in their shared suffering, Catherine recognized a fundamental truth. The system depended on isolation, but isolation could be penetrated. Words, gestures, even the smallest signs of understanding could become acts of connection and resistance. In the barn, labor became a stage for subtle power dynamics. Catherine noticed how Joshua shifted weight quietly to ease her burden, how Samuel's meticulous notes betrayed empathy in the margins, how Daniel's watchful eyes protected not just her body but her mind. These acts, though hidden, were rebellions of their own, small explosions of humanity within the walls of systemic cruelty. And with each revelation, Catherine's understanding of control deepened. It was not merely physical, it was psychological, institutional, and social, the very structure of Southern society. The wealth, the influence, the rigid adherence to appearances enabled the cruelty, and those in positions of perceived power depended upon the compliance of everyone below them. Catherine's awareness began to take shape as strategy. She realized that observation was the first step toward influence, that knowledge could be wielded subtly to shift outcomes, and that the men, despite their fear, could become allies in survival if approached with care. And here, in the shadows of the barns and the quiet between tasks, Catherine understood a dangerous truth. To endure was not enough. To survive, she would have to learn the architecture of oppression, the rhythm of cruelty, and the hidden pathways to power. And she would have to teach herself patience, calculation, and the cold precision that her mother wielded with deadly efficiency. By midsummer, Catherine had become something more than a daughter, trapped in her mother's obsession. She was an observer, a strategist, a silent architect of influence within the barn. Every motion, every glance, every pause was catalogued. She knew the limits of the three men, their routines, their fears, and their small acts of defiance. Joshua's quiet interventions, Samuel's meticulous notes, Daniel's watchful presence. They were no longer just observers or enforcers. They were variables in a system that Catherine was beginning to map, a system she could, with precision, manipulate. Labor continued with relentless intensity, but now Catherine approached each task with intention. She discovered that a subtle tilt of a sack could conserve energy without detection. A whispered cough or the slightest hesitation could communicate suffering without inviting punishment. In these small adjustments, she exercised a power her mother had never anticipated, the power of control within constraint. Catherine realized that the more she endured visibly, the more the men could act subtly on her behalf, and the more the system's weaknesses became apparent. Every day she learned the architecture of cruelty, the way fear was weaponized, how routines enforced submission, how appearances maintained authority, and she internalized it as knowledge, as armor. The barn, once merely a place of punishment, became a theater of quiet observation. Catherine watched Lucinda's visits with careful scrutiny. The mistress's journal entries, precise and detached, revealed not just measurements but patterns of expectation, thresholds of compliance, and, most importantly, the blind spots created by obsession. Every repetition, every formulaic inspection became an instruction manual for survival. Catherine began anticipating her mother's next move before it happened. Where she would circle, what notes she would make, which gestures would carry hidden threats. In this awareness lay a subtle advantage. To understand the mind of the oppressor is the first step toward neutralizing them. And then came the whispers. Small, careful, almost imperceptible communications among the girls across neighboring estates. Daniel, occasionally sent to deliver supplies, brought back fragmented news. Other daughters, enduring the same regimen, the same exhaustion, the same precise manipulation. Catherine listened, cataloged, and began to recognize patterns beyond her immediate experience. This was no longer about survival alone. It was about comprehension. Understanding the machinery of control, she realized, was the first step toward dismantling it from within. At this moment, Catherine's perspective shifted. The barn was no longer a prison in the singular sense. It was a laboratory, a place where she could study human behavior, power, and cruelty at its most calculated. And in this crucible, a dangerous thought formed. The people who claimed absolute control over her life were themselves predictable, flawed, and, if approached with patience and precision, manipulable. Catherine's transformation was no longer merely physical. It had become strategic, subtle, and dangerously intelligent. She understood that in the eyes of her mother, obedience was the ultimate currency. But within the barn, she discovered an unspoken truth. Compliance could be simulated while influence quietly shifted elsewhere. Every sigh, every faltering step, every grunt of exhaustion became a calculated tool. A signal to the men, a message to herself, a means to test the boundaries of authority. Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel had become more than mere overseers. They were components in a system that Catherine was beginning to manipulate with precision. She noticed that Joshua, despite his stoic demeanor, hesitated when tasks required unnecessary suffering. Samuel's eyes lingered on her longer than required, noting the cracks in the regimen. Daniel, youthful and sensitive, absorbed the unspoken patterns of cruelty like a sponge. Catherine began to direct them subtly, a glance here, a momentary pause there, suggesting adjustments without verbal instruction. These small interventions were invisible to Lucinda, but transformative for survival. The arrival of the other girls intensified the dynamic. Rebecca Cartwright, Emma Singleton, and Sarah Whitfield were each processed through the same system of labor and isolation. Catherine recognized their silent desperation and began to communicate in gestures imperceptible to the overseers, a tilt of the head, a hand brushing against a grain sack. The rhythm of work signaling empathy. She was creating a network of awareness, a quiet community forged in shared suffering, teaching them survival through observation. The cruelty that sought to break them became a tool for unity, if read with intelligence. Lucinda remained oblivious. Her journal entries were rigid, detached, an obsessive catalog of physical change devoid of psychological insight. She measured weight, counted coluses, recorded fatigue, and missed entirely the evolution within her daughter. Catherine's awareness expanded with every visit. She began predicting her mother's next move, adjusting posture, timing, and effort to manipulate perception. The illusion of obedience became a weapon, masking quiet resistance and strategic calculation. And then Catherine made a calculated mental experiment. She observed the men in moments of weakness, testing their willingness to bend rules. Small allowances, a sip of water here, an eased burden there, revealed their humanity, their limits, and their potential loyalty. She realized that even in systems designed for absolute control, human empathy, fear, and self-preservation could be leveraged. The barn, once a chamber of punishment, had become a laboratory of power. Every observation, every pause, every subtle communication a step toward understanding, surviving, and eventually undermining the authority that sought to destroy her. By mid-summer, the barn was no longer a place of mere labor. It had become a theater of control, observation, and subtle influence. Catherine had learned the rhythm of the work, the precise timing of her mother's visits, and the predictable patterns of the men. Every footstep, every tilt of the head, every careful distribution of weight became data she cataloged mentally. Lucinda's obsession with measurement and physical correction blinded her to the one thing that mattered: the mind beneath the body, and it was in that mind that true power was beginning to awaken. Catherine's influence over the three men grew imperceptibly but decisively. Joshua, who had always approached tasks with silent diligence, began to anticipate her needs before she spoke. Samuel, meticulous and literate, started leaving marginal notations in his ledger that subtly eased her burden without drawing suspicion. Daniel, sensitive and young, became her watchful shadow, silently protecting her from tasks pushed too far, from mistakes that could invite punishment. Each man, bound by survival and fear, became an unwitting participant in her emerging strategy. They did not recognize that the girl they were conditioned to break was quietly learning to bend the rules around them. The other girls, meanwhile, became vectors of observation. Catherine learned quickly to read their reactions, their fatigue, and their moments of hesitation, with imperceptible gestures, a glance, a hand brush, a measured pause. She began to communicate. She taught them how to survive the daily brutality without inciting wrath, how to conserve energy while appearing compliant, and how to subtly manipulate perception. The isolation designed to destroy individuality was being inverted, transformed into a network of quiet understanding. What Lucinda had intended as control was turning into a conduit for awareness, subtly empowering the very minds she sought to dominate. Yet the psychological tension escalated. Lucinda's visits, precise and ritualized, became exercises in observation rather than interaction. She circled, journal in hand, noting every blister, every twitch, every pound lost, but missing entirely the dynamics she could not measure. Catherine had learned to anticipate her mother's scrutiny, timing movements, controlling expressions, and shaping appearances. Obedience became illusion, and illusion became strategy. At this juncture, a crucial realization crystallized: power is never absolute. Systems, no matter how rigid, have cracks. Fear and authority can be observed, anticipated, and exploited. Catherine understood that survival required more than endurance. It demanded perception, patience, and subtle manipulation. And it was in that understanding that she began to reclaim the only agency left to her, the agency of thought, observation, and strategy, inside a system designed to strip her of both. As July burned into August, Catherine's mastery over perception became a force in itself. The barn, once a place of torment, was now a landscape she could navigate, predict, and manipulate. Every groan of exhausted muscle, every creak of timber, every flicker of shadow was a signal, a measure of control, a way to bend the environment without overt defiance. Lucinda, obsessed with physical metrics, could see only blisters, weight loss, and posture, blind to the strategic intelligence unfolding within her daughter's mind. Catherine began to experiment. Small tests, imperceptible to the mistress, revealed the boundaries of influence. A fraction of a second's hesitation in lifting a sack, a carefully timed stumble, a whispered cough. Each a probe to measure the men's reactions. Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel responded subtly, instinctively adjusting to prevent harm while maintaining the facade of obedience. In this silent feedback loop, Catherine discovered a dangerous truth. Even those who enforce oppression are predictable, and predictability is leverage. The arrival of the other daughters intensified her strategic thinking. Rebecca, Emma, and Sarah were initially terrified, isolated by the same calculated cruelty Catherine had endured. But through imperceptible gestures, a hand on a wrist, a look across a pile of grain, a shared rhythm of work, she began to teach them how to survive without surrendering entirely. The barn became a network of quiet communication, where understanding, rather than rebellion, was the lifeline. Survival was now a mental game, a psychological chessboard, with Catherine observing every piece, every move, and every flaw in the system. Lucinda remained oblivious. Her visits, ritualized and clinical, were an exercise in routine. She recorded weight, measured caluses, and noted fatigue, all metrics of her daughter's compliance, but failed to perceive the emergence of strategy, influence, and resilience. Catherine understood something profound: authority depends on invisibility of thought. The moment the oppressor perceives the mind, the illusion of control begins to fracture. And so, Catherine acted with precision. She tested limits, orchestrated subtle communications with the men, and guided the other girls in ways that left no trace for Lucinda to detect. Every action was calculated to strengthen endurance, preserve autonomy, and slowly erode the unquestioned authority imposed upon them. By observing, predicting, and manipulating, she was rewriting the rules of the barn from within. At this point, the first cracks in Lucinda's system were becoming evident, invisible to all but Catherine and the three men. Power, she realized, was not simply enforced. It could be read, measured, and quietly redirected. And it was in this knowledge, dangerous and intoxicating, that Catherine began to awaken a force Lucinda could never control: the unspoken intelligence of survival. By late summer, the barn had transformed from a chamber of punishment into a crucible of awareness. Catherine's mind, sharpened by labor, observation, and subtle experimentation, now operated like a command center. Every motion of the men, every twitch of the other girls, every approach of her mother was catalogued, analyzed, and used to her advantage. Lucinda believed she controlled everything through measurement, discipline, and fear, but in reality, she was blind to the invisible networks Catherine was quietly weaving. The other girls, once paralyzed by exhaustion and terror, began to respond to Catherine's subtle guidance. A shared rhythm of work, a slight tilt of a head, a careful adjustment of load placement, all imperceptible to the overseers, became a language of survival. Rebecca learned to pace her strength to conserve energy. Emma discovered how to maintain dignity. While enduring relentless labor, Sarah recognized the small opportunities to signal distress or fatigue without inciting punishment. Each act of understanding was a minor victory, a quiet reclamation of agency within the framework of cruelty. Catherine's influence over Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel had also solidified. She observed Joshua's instinct to shield her from excessive strain, Samuel's precise but empathetic adjustments, and Daniel's protective attentiveness. In careful, almost imperceptible ways, she began directing their actions, creating moments of relief for herself and the other girls without disrupting the appearance of obedience. Each intervention was a test of loyalty, a measure of subtle alliance, and a lesson in understanding the psychology of those who enforce authority. Lucinda's visits remained ritualized, her obsession with metrics undiminished, yet increasingly predictable. Catherine learned the timing of her mother's approach, the cadence of her journal entries, the order in which she inspected the girls. With this knowledge, she adjusted posture, effort, and expression, crafting an illusion of compliance while exercising precise control over her environment. Fear, the primary weapon of her mother's authority, became a tool Catherine could manipulate, converting oppression into strategic advantage. And then came the realization that would define the coming month's survival was not just endurance. It was orchestration. Observing, predicting, and subtly influencing those around her became a method of reclaiming agency in a world designed to strip it away. Power, she understood, was not absolute. It could be read, anticipated, and gently redirected. By leveraging knowledge, patience, and observation, Catherine transformed the barn from a prison into a domain of quiet influence, a place where cruelty could be anticipated, mitigated, and ultimately undermined. As late summer bled into early autumn, Catherine's understanding of power had grown sharper, more precise, and dangerously sophisticated. The barn was no longer merely a site of punishment. It was a laboratory of influence, a map of human behavior, and a proving ground for strategy. Lucinda continued her visits with meticulous regularity, her leather-bound journal in hand, recording weight, calluses, and fatigue as though the physical was the only reality that mattered. But she failed to see what Catherine had already mastered. The mind, once understood, could be as pliable as the body she sought to control. Catherine began experimenting with psychological manipulation. She learned the subtle language of Lucinda's expectations, the pauses before judgment, the brief glance that betrayed satisfaction, the shift in tone that revealed displeasure. Each movement of her body, each expression, each measured effort became a signal, a calculated performance designed to evoke specific reactions. When she appeared exhausted, Joshua subtly eased her burdens. When she feigned compliance, Samuel adjusted routines to prevent punishment. Daniel's watchful eyes ensured that none of her calculated gestures went unnoticed by those who mattered most. The barn became a stage on which she directed both perception and action, and the actors, though unaware, played along. The other girls, now acclimated to the routine, became extensions of her strategy. Through imperceptible gestures, subtle timing, and shared rhythms, Catherine began coordinating them in small acts of resistance. Conserving strength, signaling caution, and navigating the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Each act was invisible to the mistress, yet each built a network of awareness, a quiet alliance forged in shared suffering. In this microcosm, Catherine was no longer merely enduring, she was orchestrating, subtly shifting dynamics, and reclaiming agency piece by piece. Lucinda's obsession with precision became her blind spot. The mistress measured, documented, and assessed, but the patterns she sought to enforce had already been anticipated and subverted. Every prediction Catherine made, every adjustment she calculated, was a small fracture in the illusion of absolute control. She began to understand a terrifying truth: authority depends on perception. When perception is manipulated, fear loses its absolute power, and control becomes negotiable. By the time September arrived, Catherine had quietly transformed the barn into a realm of calculated influence. She could anticipate behavior, guide actions, and orchestrate subtle resistance, all without leaving evidence of disobedience. The cruel system that Lucinda had built to dominate and erase her individuality was now a framework Catherine could navigate, exploit, and bend to her emerging strategy. The first cracks in her mother's absolute authority had appeared, and Catherine was learning to widen them, carefully, deliberately, and with terrifying precision. By October, the barn had become more than a place of survival. It was Catherine's domain of observation and subtle influence. Each day, the patterns of labor, the rhythm of the men, and the responses of the other girls provided her with more than knowledge. They offered leverage. She began to realize that the physical transformation her mother obsessed over was only one layer of control. The real dominion was psychological, and Catherine now held the tools to navigate it with precision. She began small experiments with the three men, testing boundaries, observing reactions, and gradually shaping behavior, without breaking the illusion of obedience. A slight hesitation in carrying a heavy sack prompted Joshua to shift the weight silently. A whispered question about ration adjustments allowed Samuel to discreetly provide relief. Daniel, sensitive to the unspoken, adjusted his watchfulness in response to her cues. In each interaction, Catherine was not merely surviving. She was learning to direct, to influence, to orchestrate action without drawing scrutiny. The other girls became unwitting participants in a subtle choreography of endurance and resistance. A tilted head, a carefully timed pause, the synchronized handling of heavy sacks. These were not just acts of survival, but forms of communication, teaching one another to endure without submission. Catherine watched, guided, and refined, transforming passive compliance into an invisible network of knowledge and adaptation. In these moments, she understood that influence was more powerful than obedience, and subtlety more dangerous than confrontation. Lucinda's visits remained ritualized and precise, yet the mistress remained blind to the shifting dynamics around her. She recorded weight, inspected hands, and noted exhaustion, believing that the physical narrative defined control. She could not perceive the emergent intelligence in her daughter, nor the subtle cooperation between the girls and the three men. Each observation Catherine made, Each reaction she provoked widened the fissures in her mother's illusion of power. And then came a revelation Catherine had been waiting for. The system, built to isolate and dominate, relied entirely on secrecy and obedience. Once those boundaries were breached, even in small ways, control became negotiable. She began planning her subtle acts of disruption, knowing that they could ripple outward. She decided to test the men's loyalty further, to see whether small allowances could be expanded without detection, and to teach the other girls the invisible strategies of endurance and influence. In this realization, Catherine discovered a terrifying truth. The oppressor's power is strongest when believed unassailable, and most vulnerable when quietly understood. At this point, the barn was no longer simply a chamber of labor. It was a crucible of strategy, an incubator for resistance, and Catherine's mind had become a weapon. And now she was ready to act. By late October, Catherine's awareness had crystallized into action. The barn, once a place of enforced labor and silent suffering, had become a laboratory of influence. Every glance, every pause, every gesture was a calculated tool. She had learned the men's limits, their tendencies, and their small acts of compassion. She had observed the other girls, decoding fear, endurance, and resilience. Now she was ready to act, not recklessly, but with precision, testing the boundaries of the oppressive system that had sought to strip her of everything. The first steps were imperceptible, a slight delay in completing a task, a measured sigh, the strategic placement of a heavy sack, small deviations from the prescribed routine that forced the men to adjust without alerting Lucinda. Joshua began easing her workload in ways invisible to the mistress. Samuel subtly modified the ledger entries to provide small allowances. Daniel, vigilant, reinforced her intentions through protective positioning. Each man, bound by fear and instinct, had become a participant in her unspoken plan, unaware that the girl they were conditioned to control was quietly shaping their actions. The other girls, too, became instruments in her subtle orchestration. A glance here, a tilt of the head there, a shared rhythm of work. They began to communicate without words, learning the strategies of endurance and influence. Isolation, which was designed to crush individuality, became a tool for connection. They were learning to survive as one, silently, invisibly, and Catherine guided them like a mentor, teaching patience, perception, and the quiet art of manipulation. And now, Catherine turns to you, the observer. This is not just a story. It is a call to recognize the architecture of control that exists in all systems. Comment the phrase, "I see the cracks," twice in the comments. Repeat it. Let it settle. This is your acknowledgement, your subtle alignment with the knowledge you are awakening to. It is a lock-in of awareness, a symbolic step toward understanding systems of power, influence, and unseen control. Say it aloud in your mind, let it resonate. I see the cracks. I see the cracks. In these moments, the barn became more than a place of suffering. It became a site of revelation. Catherine had discovered the fundamental law of power. Observation precedes influence, influence precedes survival, and survival precedes transformation. The invisible network she had created, the alliances she had forged, and the calculated manipulations she had executed had already begun to destabilize the system her mother believed absolute. And in this destabilization lay the first sparks of freedom, insight, and a force that Lucinda could never predict or control. By November, the dynamics in the barn had shifted profoundly, though Lucinda remained blind to it. She still circled in her measured steps, journal in hand, recording weight, caluses, and exhaustion, confident that every detail proved her control. Yet what she could not measure, could not quantify, was the invisible network of influence Catherine had created. Every gesture, every subtle signal, every silent coordination among the girls and the men was quietly dismantling the illusion of absolute authority. Catherine began to push the boundaries more deliberately. A subtle hesitation in a chore prompted Joshua, to offer silent assistance. Samuel allowed minor adjustments that relieved exhaustion. Daniel's protective positioning became a shield against unnecessary punishment. Each intervention was invisible to Lucinda, yet it represented a small fracture in the control she believed unbreakable. Catherine had learned that power could be redirected without confrontation. That influence, carefully applied, was more potent than outright defiance. The girls, under Catherine's subtle mentorship, began acting with quiet agency. Rebecca conserved energy by redistributing burdens strategically. Emma synchronized her efforts to minimize strain, and Sarah developed a rhythm that allowed for short, imperceptible rest without detection. Together, they created a silent network of endurance and adaptation. The barn, meant to isolate and crush them, had become a crucible of understanding, a microcosm where perception, subtlety, and coordination were more powerful than brute authority. Lucinda's obsession with control became her blind spot. She could see the physical changes, weight loss, calloused hands, fatigued bodies, but she could not perceive the mental architecture Catherine was constructing. Every calculation, every observation, every small act of influence was invisible to her. Catherine understood the terrifying law of power. Those who assume control over others often fail to observe the mind, the intentions, the small, imperceptible decisions that define autonomy. Now, the stage was set for the final psychological confrontation. Catherine, armed with insight, observation, and subtle alliances, could guide the barn's reality without ever breaking the facade of obedience. The system that sought to crush her spirit and enforce submission had become pliable in her hands. Each day, she manipulated perception, orchestrated small victories, and widened the fissures in Lucinda's control. The mistress believed herself omnipotent, yet the truth was clear. In systems of fear, knowledge and subtle influence are the most dangerous weapons of all. And in this evolving battlefield, Catherine discovered a profound, dangerous truth: survival alone is passive, but influence transforms endurance into power. She was no longer merely enduring the cruelty, she was quietly reshaping it, learning the art of invisible command that would define her emerging autonomy, and that of the girls and men around her. Winter approached, and with it came the full reckoning of the barn's invisible transformation. Catherine, having spent months observing, manipulating, and guiding, now held a command over the environment that Lucinda could not fathom. The three men, once instruments of enforcement, had become subtle allies. The other girls, once terrified and isolated, had learned the rhythms of endurance and the language of quiet influence. The barn, meant to crush individuality, had become a crucible of strategic intelligence and psychological mastery. Lucinda arrived one afternoon, journal in hand, expecting to find fatigue, submission, and evidence of her daughter's physical compliance. She noted the weight loss, the calloused hands, the controlled posture, and felt a fleeting satisfaction. But she could not perceive the underlying currents, the subtle coordination among the girls, the men's invisible protective interventions, or Catherine's precise orchestration of perception. In her obsession with the tangible, she had overlooked the true power of the mind, the network of awareness, and the quiet recalibration of authority. Catherine had learned the final truth about systems of control: they appear absolute only to those who do not understand their underlying mechanics. Fear, labor, and measurement may enforce compliance, but influence, observation, and subtle action create autonomy. Each day, she had quietly redirected attention, redistributed effort, and calibrated appearances. Every whispered glance, every shifted burden, every carefully timed gesture had undermined the mistress's control. While preserving the illusion of obedience, she had turned the instruments of oppression into tools of subtle freedom. By December, the barn was no longer a site of domination. It was a theater of invisible mastery. Catherine moved among the girls and the men, each interaction a precise calibration of endurance, protection, and subtle guidance. Lucinda continued to measure, document, and judge, never realizing the transformation had extended far beyond the physical. What had begun as punishment had evolved into the quiet construction of power. Catherine had learned that survival is only the beginning. Influence transforms endurance into autonomy, and knowledge becomes the ultimate weapon. The lesson of the Kellerman barn is chilling yet undeniable. Systems of control are fragile when observed, anticipated, and understood. Authority depends on perception, fear depends on ignorance, and compliance is only as absolute as the mind allows it to be. Catherine's journey reveals the dangerous truth. Hidden in plain sight, knowledge is power, observation is leverage, and even the most oppressive structures can be quietly reshaped by a mind capable of seeing the cracks. And so, the barn remained silent, its horrors recorded in memory, yet its legacy inverted, a monument not to cruelty, but to the unyielding intelligence, resilience, and strategic mastery of a young woman who refused to surrender her mind. The most dangerous power, it seems, is the one the oppressor cannot see coming. This concludes all 15 sections. Each builds the descent into forbidden knowledge, psychological tension, and the subtle mastery of power.